Blood trickled from Margaret Ellis's lip as Officer Sullivan towered over her, his badge glinting in the Chicago sun. "You should know your place," he hissed. Neither knew this traffic stop would shake the Windy City to its core and expose decades of corruption, beginning with the dashcam footage about to go viral. Before we dive into this powerful story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments, hit that like button, and subscribe to catch more untold stories of courage and justice. Now, let's discover how a routine traffic stop became the catalyst for change across Chicago. Margaret Ellis adjusted her pearl necklace as she drove her immaculate midnight blue Lincoln Continental down the tree-lined streets of Oak Park, a quiet suburb west of Chicago. At 71, she carried herself with the same grace and dignity that had defined her 43-year career as an elementary school principal at Westside Academy. The morning sunlight filtered through the oak trees, casting dappled shadows across her meticulously maintained vehicle as she made her way to Sunday service at First Baptist Church, where she had been a devoted member for over 5 decades. Her husband Walter had passed away 5 years earlier after a brief battle with pancreatic cancer, leaving her to navigate widowhood with the same quiet strength she had shown when raising their 3 children during the tumultuous 1970s and 80s on Chicago's West Side. Margaret had become a pillar in the Oak Park community since moving there 15 years ago, serving on the library board, organizing the annual Neighborhood Watch program, and volunteering 3 days a week at the community food pantry. Her Lincoln, a 70th birthday gift from her children, was her pride and joy. Always spotless and maintained with religious regularity at Walter's old mechanic shop, now run by his former apprentice. As Margaret signaled to turn onto Lake Street, she noticed a police cruiser in her rearview mirror that had been following her for the past 3 blocks. A flutter of unease rippled through her chest, a feeling she had known since childhood growing up in Mississippi during the final violent years of Jim Crow. The cruiser's lights suddenly flashed blue and red, and the brief whoop of the siren indicated she should pull over. Margaret carefully guided her Lincoln to the curb, positioning it perfectly parallel to the sidewalk as she had taught her own children to do. Her hands instinctively moved to 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, her posture straightening as she took a deep breath and prepared her documents. Officer James Sullivan approached with a hand already resting on his holstered weapon, his mirrored sunglasses reflecting Margaret's composed face as he reached her window. "License and registration," he barked without preamble or greeting. His voice carried none of the professional courtesy she had observed in other encounters with Oak Park police over the years. "Good morning, officer," Margaret replied, her voice steady despite the rapidly accelerating beat of her heart. "May I ask why I've been stopped?" The officer's face hardened at her question. "I said license and registration, ma'am." "You can save your questions for later." Margaret maintained her dignified composure as she carefully reached for her purse on the passenger seat. "I'm reaching for my purse to get my license, officer," she narrated calmly, a habit instilled in her children and grandchildren for police interactions. Officer Sullivan watched her with visible impatience as she retrieved her license, insurance card, and registration from her meticulously organized wallet. As she handed over the documents, Margaret noticed a slight tremble in her fingers, not from fear, but from the controlled anger she had mastered over decades of facing subtle and overt discrimination. Sullivan examined her documents with exaggerated scrutiny, holding them up to the light as if suspecting forgery. "This your car, Mrs. Ellis?" he asked, emphasizing her name with a tone that suggested disbelief. "Yes, officer. For almost 2 years now. It was a gift from my children." Sullivan's mouth twitched slightly. "Kind of nice for this neighborhood. Mind telling me how someone like you affords a vehicle like this?" The implication hung in the air between them, heavy and unmistakable. Margaret felt her jaw tighten but kept her voice level. "I was an elementary school principal for 43 years. Officer Sullivan. My late husband was a master mechanic who owned his own shop. We've always lived within our means. as the officer continued to question her with increasing hostility. Margaret discreetly pressed the voice recording button on her phone, an app her son had installed last Christmas, just in case, though she had hoped never to need it. A second patrol car pulled up behind Sullivan's, and a younger officer approached, Officer Daniel Bennett, whose fresh face and somewhat uncertain demeanor suggested he was relatively new to the force. Bennett nodded respectfully to Margaret before turning to Sullivan, who was now claiming he had reason to believe the vehicle might be stolen despite the matching registration in Margaret's name. "Step out of the vehicle, Mrs. Ellis," Sullivan demanded suddenly. "Sir, may I ask why that's necessary?" "I've provided all the required documentation," Margaret replied, maintaining eye contact despite the officer's intimidating stance. "Don't make me ask twice," Sullivan responded, his hand returning to his weapon. Margaret carefully exited her Lincoln, the hem of her Sunday dress catching slightly on the door as she stepped onto the curb. The spring sunshine felt suddenly hot against her skin as she stood in her church clothes while Sullivan circled her car like a predator. Neighbors walking their dogs or tending to their yards began to take notice of the scene unfolding. Across the street, Thomas Washington, a fellow church member, slowed his pace and pulled out his phone, discreetly beginning to record. Margaret stood straight back despite the discomfort of her arthritis, a lifetime of lessons in her head. "Don't make sudden movements. Keep your hands visible. Stay calm. Address officers as sir or officer." Lessons she had drilled into her son Michael when he turned 12. The same lessons her father had taught her brothers in Mississippi, the same lessons she later taught her grandsons. The weight of generations of survival tactics pressed down on her shoulders as she watched Officer Sullivan begin to search her car without permission. Officer Bennett standing by with a troubled expression on his young face. "Ma'am, could you please stand over by the patrol car while we run your information?" Sullivan called out, though Margaret noted he was already running her plates and license. What he really wanted was to separate her from her vehicle while he conducted his illegal search. As she moved to the spot indicated, Margaret felt the eyes of gathering neighbors upon her, some concerned, some curious, some deliberately looking away. She stood in perfect posture, her Sunday hat providing little shield against the growing heat or the growing humiliation of being treated like a criminal in front of the community where she had built a respected life. Officer James Sullivan had been with the Oak Park Police Department for 14 years, transferring from Chicago's South Side district after a series of misunderstandings with his former supervisors. What his personnel file didn't explicitly state, but what was understood among certain circles, was that Sullivan had developed a reputation for aggressive enforcement in predominantly black neighborhoods, resulting in multiple civilian complaints that were systematically buried by sympathetic superiors. His dashboard camera had mysteriously malfunctioned during several contentious traffic stops, and witness accounts contradicting his arrest reports were frequently dismissed as unreliable. At 42, Sullivan's once promising career had stalled at the rank of patrol officer, a fact that gnawed at him daily as he watched younger officers advance past him. His recent divorce had left him financially strained, with child support payments for 3 children eating into his salary and forcing him to moonlight as a security guard at a downtown Chicago office building. The combination of professional frustration, financial pressure, and personal bitterness had hardened into a perpetual anger that he increasingly directed at those he perceived as easy targets, particularly well-off black residents in the predominantly white suburbs he patrolled. As Sullivan methodically searched Margaret Ellis's immaculate Lincoln, rookie officer Daniel Bennett shifted uncomfortably from foot to foot. Just 8 months out of the police academy, Bennett had been paired with Sullivan as part of the department's field training program. But the education he was receiving bore little resemblance to the community-oriented policing emphasized in his training. Bennett watched as Sullivan's gloved hands moved purposefully through the vehicle's interior, opening the glove compartment, checking under seats, and rifling through the small leather organizer and the center console. "Sir," Bennett ventured cautiously, The registration and insurance check out. Dispatch confirmed the vehicle belongs to Mrs. Ellis. Sullivan barely glanced up. I know how to do my job, rookie. Keep an eye on her while I finish here. Bennett turned toward Margaret, who stood perfectly still by the patrol car, her eyes never leaving Sullivan as he continued his unauthorized search. Bennett noticed the slight tremor in her clasped hands, the only visible sign of her distress. From her position by the patrol car, Margaret observed with growing alarm as Sullivan's search became more invasive. She saw him check areas of her car she knew had been empty when she left home, the small compartment in her door, the space beneath her seats. When he emerged from the passenger's side holding a small plastic bag containing what appeared to be white powder, Margaret felt her heart constrict. The bag hadn't been there when she entered her car that morning, she was certain of it. Look what we have here, Sullivan announced loudly enough for the gathering neighbors to hear. Margaret maintained her composed exterior while her mind raced. She had seen this tactic before, a planted bag, a fabricated charge, a life derailed. But confronting him directly could escalate the situation dangerously. She remained silent, strategically choosing when to fight this battle. This wasn't the first time Sullivan had employed such tactics. 3 months earlier, he had stopped Jamal Washington, a 19-year-old college student, for a broken taillight, eventually arresting him for resisting arrest, when the young man questioned why he needed to exit his vehicle. 6 weeks before that, Sullivan had detained Dr. Kimberly Jackson, a prominent pediatrician, for matching the description of a shoplifter reported miles away and hours earlier. And just last year, he had drawn his weapon on Marcus Thompson, a 55-year-old postal worker, for reaching for his wallet too quickly during a routine traffic stop. Each incident had resulted in civilian complaints that were quietly resolved with minimal disciplinary action, protected by Chief Raymond Wilson, who had come up through the ranks with Sullivan's father and maintained the department's unofficial policy of handling such matters internally. Bennett's discomfort grew as he watched the situation unfold. During his academy training, he had scored highest in his class on community relations and de-escalation techniques. His decision to join law enforcement had been inspired by his grandfather, who had served as one of Chicago's first black police lieutenants in the 1970s. The growing disparity between his ideals and the reality of his field training had created an increasingly painful cognitive dissonance that he struggled to reconcile. Officer Sullivan, Bennett said quietly, perhaps we should. Sullivan cut him off with a sharp glare. What you should do is call for the K-9 unit. Tell them we've found suspicious substances and need a full vehicle search. Bennett hesitated, his hand on his radio. Sir, I'm not sure that wasn't a suggestion, Officer Bennett. Sullivan interrupted, his voice carrying the full weight of his seniority. As Bennett reluctantly made the call, Margaret felt a sudden tightness in her chest that had nothing to do with fear. At 71, she had managed her mild heart condition with medication and regular checkups. But the stress of the situation was triggering familiar warning signs, a slight pressure beneath her breastbone, a faint tingling in her left arm. She took slow, measured breaths, determined not to show weakness. Sullivan approached her, holding up the small bag in a gloved hand. Want to explain this, Mrs. Ellis? He asked, his voice carrying a mock politeness that several onlookers clearly recognized as performative. Margaret looked him directly in the eyes. That is not mine, Officer Sullivan. I have never seen that before, and I believe you know that. Her voice remained steady, though the pressure in her chest intensified. Sullivan's smirk was barely concealed. Everyone says that. Ma'am. The judge won't find that very original. Margaret maintained her dignified stance despite the growing discomfort. I'm not feeling well, officer. I have a heart condition. And I need to take my medication, which is in my purse. Sullivan's expression didn't change. We'll get to that after we finish processing the scene. Wouldn't want you tampering with evidence or taking something that might interfere with a drug test, The cruelty was deliberate, and Margaret recognized it as such. She had seen this type of power display throughout her life, the unnecessary withholding of basic humanity, as a demonstration of control. Several more neighbors had gathered at a respectful distance, smartphones raised to capture the increasingly troubling scene. Sullivan noticed but seemed unconcerned, perhaps even energized by the audience. "Officer Bennett," Margaret called, her voice slightly weaker than before, "I'm truly not feeling well." Bennett looked at her with genuine concern, then back at Sullivan, who was already walking toward his patrol car, evidence bag in hand. "Just theatrics," Sullivan called over his shoulder. "They all try something when they're caught." Bennett moved closer to Margaret, lowering his voice. "Are you on medication, ma'am? What do you need?" Before she could answer, Sullivan barked from the car, "Bennett! Get over here and stop fraternizing with the suspect." As Bennett reluctantly moved away, Margaret closed her eyes briefly, gathering her strength. The pain in her chest wasn't severe yet, but she knew from experience it could escalate quickly without her nitroglycerin tablets. The gathered crowd had grown to about a dozen people, their murmurs of concern creating a background hum that seemed to irritate Sullivan further. Margaret caught the eye of her neighbor, Eleanor Johnson, who nodded slightly, a silent communication that help was coming, that she wasn't alone. Sullivan returned with handcuffs glinting in the midday sun, and Margaret knew the situation was about to worsen. Word of Margaret Ellis's detention spread rapidly through Oak Park's tight-knit black community. Text messages bounced between church members who were expecting her at service, neighborhood watch participants who recognized her name, and former students who had grown up under her firm but loving guidance. Within 20 minutes of the initial stop, the gathering of concerned citizens had grown from a handful to nearly 30 people, maintaining a respectful distance, but clearly monitoring the situation with increasing alarm. Eleanor Johnson, a 73-year-old retired nurse and Margaret's neighbor for over a decade, approached the scene with the confident stride of someone who had witnessed similar situations in her youth during the civil rights movement. Her pale blue dress and white cardigan presented a picture of grandmotherly concern as she made her way directly toward Margaret, ignoring Officer Sullivan's warning glance. "Margaret, honey. Are you all right?" Eleanor called, her voice carrying clearly across the growing crowd. "Your church friends are worried sick. You're never late for Sunday service." Before Margaret could respond, Sullivan stepped between them. "Ma'am, this is an active investigation. Please step back." Eleanor squared her shoulders, her 5'2" frame somehow expanding with moral authority. "Young man, I've been a resident of Oak Park for 30 years, and I'm looking at a respected community member being treated like a criminal. May I ask what crime has been committed here?" Sullivan's posture stiffened at the challenge. "That's police business, ma'am. Now I'm asking you nicely to step back before you're interfering with an officer." The confrontation drew more attention, with several bystanders moving closer, phones recording. Margaret remained composed, though Eleanor could see the pallor beneath her friend's dark skin, a concerning sign given Margaret's cardiac history. Sullivan seemed increasingly agitated by the growing audience, especially as more phones appeared, documenting his every move and word. He spoke into his radio, requesting additional units for what he termed crowd control issues. Though the gathering remained entirely peaceful, the spring sun climbed higher in the sky, beating down on the asphalt and reflecting off car windows. Margaret had now been standing in the heat for nearly 40 minutes, her Sunday dress offering little protection against the rising temperature. Beads of sweat formed along her hairline, and the pressure in her chest had become a persistent discomfort that she struggled to hide. As she stood there, Margaret's mind drifted to another hot day, 53 years earlier, when she had marched with thousands of others through downtown Chicago, demanding fair housing practices and an end to redlining. She had been arrested that day too, crammed into an overheated paddy wagon with 11 other young women. singing freedom songs to keep their spirits up during the 6 hours they spent in custody before community leaders secured their release. The irony wasn't lost on her, a half-century later. Standing in an integrated suburb she had once only dreamed of living in, facing the same fundamental disrespect and suspicion. A black SUV pulled up to the scene, and Reverend James Turner emerged. His imposing 6'4" frame dressed in full Sunday vestments. As pastor of First Baptist, he had received multiple texts from concerned congregants, and immediately left his assistant to handle the morning service. Reverend Turner approached with deliberate calm. His hands visible and his movements measured, habits ingrained from decades of navigating interactions with law enforcement as a black man in America. Officers, he addressed both Sullivan and Bennett. I'm Reverend James Turner from First Baptist Church. Mrs. Ellis is a senior member of our congregation, and we're concerned about her well-being. May I speak with her? Sullivan's jaw visibly tightened. This is an active crime scene, Reverend. You'll need to step back with the others. Turner's voice remained level. I understand you're doing your job, officer, but Mrs. Ellis is 71 years old with a known heart condition. It's approaching 90 degrees out here. As her spiritual advisor, I'm concerned about her health and safety. Sullivan moved his hand to rest on his baton. One more step, and you'll be joining her for obstruction. The threat hung in the air, captured by at least a dozen recording devices. Bennett shifted uncomfortably. His academy training on community relations and de-escalation techniques screaming in his mind against what was unfolding. Several young families had joined the growing crowd. Parents trying to shield their children while explaining in hushed tones why their beloved former principal was being treated this way. 8-year-old Zoe Williams, whose mother had been Margaret's student 30 years earlier, broke away from her mother's grasp and called out, Mrs. Ellis, we made you a card for church today. The innocent interruption momentarily softened the tension, with Margaret offering a gentle smile to the child before her mother quickly pulled her back. Sullivan turned to his patrol car, where he'd been examining the contents of Margaret's purse. He pulled out a family photograph showing Margaret with a distinguished-looking man in formal attire at what appeared to be an official function. He studied it briefly before tossing it back into her purse without recognition of the man standing beside her. Had you been in Oak Park that day, watching this unfold, would you have stepped forward or kept your distance? Comment number 1 if you believe citizens should actively intervene when witnessing potential police misconduct. Or number 2 if you think it's safer to document from a distance and report later. Either way, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more real stories of injustice and accountability. Now, how would you feel if you were Officer Bennett? Torn between your training and your superior's actions? The tension was about to escalate dramatically when Sullivan returned to where Margaret stood, handcuffs dangling from his fingers. Margaret Ellis, you're being detained on suspicion of possession of a controlled substance. A collective gasp rose from the onlookers as Sullivan roughly turned Margaret around despite her lack of resistance. As the cold metal closed around her wrists, the dignity she had maintained throughout the ordeal couldn't mask her wince of pain as the tight cuffs pressed against her arthritic joints. Eleanor's voice cut through the murmurs of the crowd. This is outrageous. She's a 71-year-old grandmother with a heart condition. Sullivan ignored her, reciting Miranda rights in a mechanical tone while the crowd's anger became palpable. Children began crying, sensing the adults' distress. Parents hugged them close, the scene becoming an unwanted educational moment about the reality many Black Americans faced regardless of age, education, or standing in the community. As Sullivan began guiding Margaret toward his patrol car, her steps faltered slightly. The pain in her chest had intensified, and the combination of stress, heat, and physical discomfort was taking its toll. Bennett noticed her stumble and moved forward to offer support, earning a sharp look from Sullivan. I've got this, rookie, Sullivan growled, tightening his grip on Margaret's arm. Reverend Turner stepped forward again, his voice now carrying the full authority of his position. "Officer Sullivan, I am formally requesting that Mrs. Ellis receive immediate medical attention. As witnesses, we all observe that she is in physical distress." Sullivan turned to face the Reverend, his patience clearly exhausted. "One more word, and you're under arrest too." The confrontation had reached a dangerous tipping point, with community members growing increasingly vocal and Sullivan becoming more entrenched in his position. In that moment, Bennett made a decision. He stepped forward, positioning himself between Sullivan and the Reverend. "Sir," he said quietly to Sullivan, "I think we should consider the medical request. Department policy on detained seniors is clear about health concerns." Sullivan's glare could have melted steel, but before he could respond, his radio crackled with a message from dispatch. The expression that crossed his face as he listened was unreadable, but something had clearly changed. He keyed his mic and responded, 10-4. "We're holding position," before turning back to Margaret with a slightly altered demeanor. What none of the bystanders could know was that dispatch had just informed him that the address on Margaret's license had triggered a high-priority flag in their system, a flag that Sullivan had read during his initial database check, too focused on finding a reason to detain her. As Margaret was guided into the back of the patrol car, the crowd's protests grew louder. Eleanor Johnson pulled out her phone and made a call, her voice clear and determined as she spoke to someone who clearly held authority. "Michael, it's Eleanor Johnson. They've handcuffed your mother and put her in a police car. She's having chest pains, and they're refusing medical attention." "Yes, Oak Park PD, Officer Sullivan. It's happening right now on Lake Street near Euclid." As she hung up, Eleanor's expression shifted from concern to grim satisfaction. The storm gathering around Officer Sullivan was about to break with a force he couldn't possibly anticipate. Michael Ellis sat at his imposing mahogany desk in Chicago's City Hall, reviewing budget proposals for the police department's community outreach program. At 47, he had served as Chicago's mayor for nearly 3 years, elected on a platform of police reform, economic development for underserved neighborhoods, and transparent governance. The wall behind him displayed framed photographs documenting his journey, graduating from Northwestern Law, serving as a public defender, his terms as alderman and then as state's attorney, and finally his inauguration as the third black mayor in the city's history. His phone buzzed repeatedly on his desk. Unusual for a Sunday when he specifically set aside time for uninterrupted work. When it buzzed a 5th time in 2 minutes, he finally picked it up to find 17 text messages and 3 missed calls, all concerning his mother. The most recent text, from his childhood friend and current city council member James Washington, simply read, "Call me now. Your mom in trouble with OPPD." Michael's heart rate immediately accelerated as he dialed James's number. "What's happening with my mother?" he demanded without preamble when James answered. "She's been detained by Oak Park PD on some bogus drug charge," James replied, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Eleanor Johnson just called me. Your mom's having chest pains, and they've got her handcuffed in a squad car. Officer named Sullivan is running the show, and from what I'm hearing, it's a straight-up harassment situation." Michael was already on his feet, grabbing his jacket from the back of his chair. "Where exactly?" he asked, his voice shifting into the focused calm that his staff had come to recognize as his most dangerous state. "Lake Street near Euclid. Growing crowd of witnesses. Lots of video being taken. I'm on my way. Call my detail and have them meet me downstairs. Then get our police liaison to contact Oak Park's command center. I want the chief on site immediately." Michael ended the call and pressed the intercom button on his desk. "Nancy. Emergency situation. I need the car brought around and my security detail ready to move in 3 minutes." His executive assistant's voice came back immediately, recognizing the gravity in his tone. "On it, sir. Do you need legal team backup?" "Yes. Have Diane and Marcus meet me in Oak Park." Text them the location. As Michael strode through the ornate corridors of City Hall, his mind worked with the precision that had made him a formidable prosecutor before entering politics. His mother had moved to Oak Park 15 years ago, seeking the integrated community she and his late father had fought for during the civil rights era. The cruel irony that she now faced the very discrimination she had spent a lifetime battling wasn't lost on him. At the security desk, his 4-person detail was already waiting. Led by Detective Sergeant Williams, who had headed his protection unit since his days as state's attorney when he had prosecuted several high-profile gang cases. "Sir," Williams said as they moved toward the underground parking garage, "we've been briefed on the situation. Oak Park is outside our jurisdiction, but I'm aware," Michael cut in. "We're going as family, not in an official capacity. But make sure our presence is noted." Williams nodded, understanding the delicate balance they would need to strike. Meanwhile, in the Oak Park Police Department's dispatch center, a red flag had finally registered. When Officer Sullivan had run Margaret Ellis's driver's license, the system had tagged her address as Code Priority Alpha, a designation reserved for residences of high-ranking officials, judges, and immediate family members of key government personnel. The alert had been initially overlooked as Sullivan focused on finding a reason to detain Margaret, but when he ran her information a second time while processing the alleged drug evidence, the dispatcher on duty noticed the flag and immediately notified Sergeant Hayes, the weekend shift supervisor. Hayes, a 22-year veteran of the department, recognized the Ellis name immediately and felt his stomach drop as he reviewed the developing situation. He grabbed his keys and radio, barking to the dispatcher, "Get Chief Wilson on the phone. Tell him it's Mayor Ellis's mother, and Sullivan has her in custody. I'm heading to the scene now." As Hayes raced toward his vehicle, the dispatcher was already connecting to Chief Raymond Wilson's cell phone, interrupting his Sunday golf game with news that would end his career aspirations for advancement to Chicago's police command structure. Inside the patrol car, Margaret sat with her hands painfully cuffed behind her back, the pressure in her chest building to alarming levels. The vehicle's interior had quickly become stifling in the spring heat, and Margaret focused on taking slow, measured breaths while silently counting her heartbeats, a technique her cardiologist had taught her to monitor her condition. Through the window, she could see Officer Sullivan engaged in what appeared to be an increasingly tense radio conversation, his face flushing red as he listened to whoever was speaking from dispatch. Officer Bennett stood nearby, his expression troubled as he watched both his partner and the growing crowd of community members. Margaret could have ended this situation with a single sentence, a simple revelation of her son's identity. It would have been easy to name-drop. To watch Sullivan's face transform as he realized whose mother he had handcuffed. But decades of dignity and principle held her tongue. Her son had taught her about the importance of documentation, about letting unjust systems reveal themselves fully before seeking accountability. Document everything, stay alive. Justice comes later. Michael's advice echoed in her mind as she endured the discomfort and indignity, knowing that whatever happened next would have repercussions far beyond her individual case. Outside the patrol car, Bennett approached cautiously, opened the door, and offered a bottle of water. "Ma'am, are you okay? Do you need your medication?" he asked quietly. His voice low enough that Sullivan, still engaged in his radio conversation several yards away, couldn't hear. "My nitroglycerin tablets are in my purse," Margaret replied, her voice strained. "Small pill bottle with a white cap." Bennett nodded and moved away, returning moments later with the medication. He helped her take a tablet, his actions hidden from Sullivan's view by his body positioning. "I'm sorry about this," he whispered. "This isn't right." Margaret looked into the young officer's troubled eyes. "Then do something about it, young man. Not just for me." Bennett's response was cut short as Sullivan's voice bellowed across the scene. "Bennett! Get over here now!" As Bennett moved away, Margaret felt the nitroglycerin beginning to work, the crushing pressure in her chest easing slightly. Through the patrol car window, she could see Sullivan's face had lost its confident sneer, replaced by an expression of growing concern as he listened to his radio. What she couldn't hear was Chief Wilson's voice delivering news that was rapidly dismantling Sullivan's sense of control. "The woman you've detained is Margaret Ellis, mother of Mayor Michael Ellis. The mayor is currently en route to your location with his security detail and legal team. Sergeant Hayes is 3 minutes out. Do not escalate this situation further. I repeat, do not take any additional action until command staff arrives." Sullivan's face strained of color as the implications sank in. His career, already stalled, now faced potential implosion. He looked toward the patrol car where Margaret sat with perfect posture despite her handcuffs, her expression revealing nothing of the triumph she might justifiably feel. In the distance, sirens announced the approach of multiple vehicles, and the crowd parted as 3 black SUVs with City of Chicago insignias turned onto Lake Street, followed by 2 unmarked police vehicles. The hidden power that Sullivan had unwittingly challenged was about to make itself known, and as Margaret observed his increasingly panicked expression, she felt no satisfaction, only a deep weariness that such displays of authority were still necessary to secure the basic dignity that should have been her birthright. The black SUVs pulled to a precise stop 20 feet from Officer Sullivan's patrol car, their heavily tinted windows revealing nothing of the occupants. The crowd, which had grown to nearly 50 people, fell silent in anticipation. When the rear door of the lead vehicle opened, Mayor Michael Ellis emerged with the controlled fury of a thunderstorm contained in human form. At 6'1", with his father's broad shoulders and his mother's penetrating gaze, Michael commanded attention without effort. He wore casual Sunday clothes, dark jeans and a light blue button-down shirt with rolled sleeves, having left City Hall in too much haste for his usual suit and tie. Despite his informal attire, no one could mistake his authority as he strode toward the scene, flanked by his security detail led by Detective Sergeant Williams. Behind him emerged Diane Chin and Marcus Johnson, the top attorneys from the city's legal department, both carrying leather portfolios and wearing expressions that had intimidated countless opponents in courtrooms across Illinois. Officer Sullivan stood frozen, recognition dawning on his face as the mayor of Chicago approached. This wasn't the Michael Ellis from campaign billboards and evening news clips. This was a son witnessing his elderly mother handcuffed in a police car, and the difference was terrifying to behold. Sergeant Hayes had arrived moments earlier and now moved to intercept the advancing group, his hand extended in a placating gesture. "Mayor Ellis, I'm Sergeant Hayes with Oak Park PD. We're addressing the situation," and Michael cut him off with a raised hand, his focus entirely on reaching his mother. "Where is she?" The controlled quietness of his voice carried more impact than a shout. Hayes gestured toward the patrol car. "Sir, if you'll allow me to explain the circumstances." "The only thing you need to explain," Michael replied as he continued walking, "is why my 71-year-old mother with a documented heart condition is handcuffed in a hot patrol car instead of attending her Sunday church service." He reached the vehicle and wrenched open the door, his composure briefly cracking at the sight of Margaret's ashen complexion and the unnatural angle of her arms behind her back. "Mom," he said softly, crouching beside the car. "Are you all right?" Margaret met her son's gaze with the same dignity she had maintained throughout the ordeal. "I've been better, Michael. My chest is hurting quite badly now." Michael's expression darkened further as he turned to the officers. "Remove these handcuffs immediately, and call an ambulance." His voice had dropped to a dangerous whisper. Sullivan, who had been standing slightly apart from the scene, seemed to suddenly recognize that his career hung by a thread. He stepped forward with an entirely different demeanor than he had shown Margaret. "Sir, there appears to have been a misunderstanding. We had reason to believe, Officer Sullivan." Michael interrupted, "Having noted the name tag, every word you say is being recorded by at least 20 devices, and everything you've done here will be reviewed in excruciating detail. I strongly suggest you exercise your right to remain silent until your union representative arrives." Sullivan's mouth snapped shut as Bennett moved forward with handcuff keys, quickly freeing Margaret from her restraints. As she brought her arms forward, Michael noticed the red marks where the cuffs had cut into her wrists, and his jaw tightened visibly. Diane Chin approached with her phone to her ear. "Ambulance is 2 minutes out, sir. I've also notified the state's attorney's office about potential civil rights violations." Michael nodded without taking his eyes off his mother. The crowd had begun to murmur again, many recording the unfolding scene while others called friends and family with real-time updates. Reverend Turner moved closer, offering a silent prayer of thanks that the situation hadn't escalated beyond recovery. As paramedics arrived and began assessing Margaret, Officer Bennett approached Michael, keeping his voice low. "Sir, I'd like to speak with you privately when appropriate. There are things you should know about this stop and other incidents." Michael studied the young officer's face, recognizing the moral conflict evident in his expression. "I'll have my office contact you," he replied quietly. "Keep your body camera footage secure." Bennett nodded almost imperceptibly before stepping back as Chief Raymond Wilson arrived, having broken multiple traffic laws in his haste to reach the scene. Wilson, a 30-year veteran who had built his career on maintaining the status quo while presenting a public image of progressive policing, approached with a practiced expression of grave concern. "Mayor Ellis, I want to personally apologize for this unfortunate incident. I assure you we will conduct a thorough internal investigation." "Save it, Ray," Michael cut in, using the chief's first name to emphasize their previous professional interactions. "This isn't going away with an internal review and a press release. My legal team will be submitting formal records requests for every complaint filed against Officer Sullivan, along with the department's complete use of force data for the past 5 years, broken down by race and neighborhood." Wilson's carefully cultivated expression slipped momentarily, revealing the calculation behind his concern. As the paramedics continued their assessment of Margaret, their expressions grew more serious. "BP is 160/95, the lead paramedic reported. Pulse is rapid and irregular. We need to transport her immediately for cardiac evaluation." Michael turned back to his mother, taking her hand gently. "Mom, they need to take you to the hospital. I'll be right behind you." Margaret nodded, the pain evident in her eyes despite her attempt to maintain composure. "Michael," she said softly, "my purse and my car, don't worry about any of that," he assured her. "Just focus on feeling better." As the paramedics prepared to load Margaret into the ambulance, she reached out and grasped Sullivan's wrist with surprising strength, pulling him slightly closer. "Young man," she said, her voice weak but clear, "I hope you learned something today about jumping to conclusions." The simple dignity of her statement, delivered without anger or triumph, landed with more impact than any threat or accusation could have. Sullivan's face flushed with shame as he stepped back, unable to meet her gaze. As Margaret was loaded into the ambulance, Michael turned to address the gathered crowd. "Thank you all for being here for my mother today. Your presence, your recordings, your concern, they matter. This is how communities protect each other." He then turned to his legal team. "I want formal statements from every witness willing to provide one. Set up at the community center if they'll open for us." Eleanor Johnson stepped forward. "I've already called the director. They're opening the doors now." Michael nodded gratefully before turning back to Chief Wilson and Sergeant Hayes. "I expect every piece of evidence from this incident preserved, including the alleged substance Officer Sullivan claims to have found. My team will be submitting formal requests within the hour." Wilson's expression remained carefully neutral. "Of course, Mayor. We want transparency just as much as you do." The skeptical murmur that ran through the crowd suggested few believed this statement. As Michael prepared to follow the ambulance, Officer Bennett approached once more, slipping a folded note into the mayor's hand while appearing to simply shake it. Michael pocketed the note without comment before addressing Sullivan one final time. Officer Sullivan, I want you to know that what happened here today isn't just about my mother. It's about every person who lacks the protection of a high-profile relative, people who endure these indignities without cameras or witnesses or the mayor showing up. Remember their faces as you consider your actions going forward. With that, Michael returned to his vehicle, instructing his driver to follow the ambulance while he made a series of calls that would set in motion a reckoning for the Oak Park Police Department. In the patrol car, Sullivan sat silently, his career flashing before his eyes as he realized the full magnitude of his miscalculation. Beside him, Sergeant Hayes radiated cold fury. Of all the people in Oak Park, Hayes said quietly, you had to harass the mayor's mother. The mayor who ran on police accountability. The mayor whose office has subpoena power for our records. The mayor who chairs the Regional Law Enforcement Oversight Committee. Sullivan had no response as the enormity of his situation began to sink in. The turning point hadn't just been Michael Ellis's arrival. It had been the moment Sullivan decided that an elderly black woman in an expensive car didn't deserve the basic dignity and presumption of innocence that should be every citizen's right. As the crowd slowly dispersed, many remained to give statements to the mayor's legal team. The community had been activated in a way that transcended this single incident, with neighbors exchanging contact information and discussing next steps for addressing broader concerns about policing in their community. What had begun as one officer's biased traffic stop was rapidly evolving into a catalyst for the very accountability that Margaret and Walter Ellis had spent their lives fighting for. The cardiac care unit at Rush Oak Park Hospital hummed with quiet efficiency as nurses moved between monitoring stations and patient rooms. In a private room secured by Michael's security detail, Margaret Ellis rested against crisp white pillows, her condition stabilized but still concerning enough to warrant overnight observation. The cardiac specialist had confirmed what Margaret already knew. She had experienced a stress-induced cardiac event that, while not a full heart attack, had caused dangerous irregularities in her heart rhythm. The tight handcuffs had left angry red marks on her wrists, aggravating her arthritis and requiring cold compresses to reduce the swelling. Michael sat beside her bed, his suit jacket draped over a nearby chair, tie loosened, as he conducted a series of hushed phone calls that would reshape Oak Park's approach to policing. Across the hall in a small conference room, Diane Chin and Marcus Johnson met with their expanded legal team, reviewing witness statements and body camera footage secured through emergency preservation orders. We've got 27 civilian videos so far, Marcus reported, scrolling through a digital evidence log on his tablet, plus statements from 34 witnesses, including Reverend Turner and Dr. Washington, both of whom have impeccable community standing. Diane nodded, making notes on her legal pad. What about Sullivan's disciplinary file? Any progress on that? The department claims they need 48 hours to compile it, Marcus replied, his tone making clear his skepticism. We've filed emergency motions to prevent any alterations. Judge Ramirez is reviewing our request for a same-day production order. Meanwhile, at Oak Park Police Headquarters, Chief Raymond Wilson sat in his office with the department's legal counsel and union representative, attempting to craft a response that might contain the growing crisis. Sullivan's record is problematic, the department attorney admitted, reviewing the personnel file spread across Wilson's desk. 6 civilian complaints in the past 3 years, all from minority residents. 2 excessive force allegations that were internally dismissed. And his body camera malfunctioned during 3 separate incidents. The union rep leaned forward. But nothing sustained. No formal disciplinary actions. Wilson rubbed his temples, feeling the headache that had been building since his interrupted golf game. Mayor Ellis isn't going to care about sustained versus unsustained. He's going to care that every single complaint came from a black or Latino resident, and that we cleared Sullivan each time. The attorney nodded grimly. There's more. We've got a pattern problem. Preliminary analysis shows black drivers in Oak Park are 4 times more likely to be searched during traffic stops than white drivers, despite lower contraband hit rates. The implications hung heavy in the air. This wasn't just about one officer or one incident, it was about systemic patterns that could trigger federal oversight and years of mandated reforms. Before Wilson could respond, his phone rang. The display showed a number he recognized instantly: the governor's office. Back at the hospital, Michael stepped out of his mother's room to take a call from Governor Pratt, a political ally who had backed Michael's mayoral campaign. "Michael, I just heard. How's your mother doing?" the governor asked, genuine concern in his voice. "Stable but still under observation," Michael replied. "The doctors are monitoring her cardiac rhythm overnight." "Thank God." "Listen. I've directed the State Police Oversight Division to open a preliminary review of Oak Park PD's stop and search practices. This incident raises serious questions about their departmental culture." Michael leaned against the corridor wall, watching his security detail stationed at both ends of the hallway. "I appreciate that, Governor. But this can't be just about my mother because of who I am. This has to be about changing the system for everyone who doesn't have the mayor as a son." "Agreed," the governor replied. "That's why I'm calling. What do you need from my office to effect real change here?" As Michael outlined his requests for state-level support, Officer Bennett sat in his apartment reviewing his own copies of body camera footage from the past 6 months of patrols with Sullivan. He had downloaded the files against department policy, knowing they might disappear in the coming investigation. The evidence was damning, a clear pattern of Sullivan targeting minority drivers, particularly those in expensive vehicles or nice neighborhoods. As Bennett compiled the footage onto an encrypted drive, his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. "Officer Bennett? This is Diane Chun from Mayor Ellis's legal team. Do you have a moment to talk?" Outside the hospital, a crowd had begun to gather as news of the incident spread through social media and community networks. Handmade signs reading, "Justice for Margaret Ellis," and "Black Lives Matter in Oak Park," appeared as community organizers quickly mobilized a peaceful demonstration. Local news vans set up remote broadcast positions, and reporters jockeyed for statements from hospital officials or the mayor's staff. Inside Margaret's hospital room, she awakened from a brief nap to find Eleanor Johnson sitting beside her bed, knitting a scarf with practiced precision. "Eleanor," Margaret said, her voice stronger than it had been hours earlier. "You should be home resting." Eleanor snorted softly. "After the day you've had, you're worried about me? Besides, someone needs to keep an eye on that son of yours before he tears down the entire Oak Park government in one afternoon." Margaret smiled despite her discomfort. "He gets that righteousness from his father. Walter would have been even less diplomatic." Eleanor set her knitting aside and leaned closer. "Margaret, you need to know something. What happened today, it's already bigger than just you. 3 other families have contacted Reverend Turner saying Officer Sullivan did similar things to their loved ones. One young man spent 2 months in county lockup because of planted evidence before the charges were dropped for insufficient evidence." Margaret's expression grew solemn. "This was never about just me, Eleanor. This was about all of us who've had to teach our children those extra rules for survival." She reached for her friend's hand. "When Michael comes back, tell him I want to talk to those families. Do you think what happened to Margaret Ellis is an isolated incident or part of a larger systemic problem? Comment number 1 if you believe these are individual, bad apples, in law enforcement, or number 2 if you see this as evidence of deeper structural issues. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories that expose injustice and celebrate resilience. What would you do if you were Michael Ellis? Torn between your role as a son and your position as mayor? The stakes were about to get even higher as a nurse entered with Margaret's dinner tray, followed by Michael returning from his calls. "Mom," he said, his expression serious as he took a seat beside her bed. "We need to talk about what happens next." Chief Wilson has offered a private settlement, a substantial amount with a non-disclosure agreement. Margaret's response was immediate and firm. Absolutely not. This isn't about money, Michael. This is about all the people who don't have a son who's the mayor. Michael nodded, having anticipated her answer. That's what I told him. I've also turned down his offer to terminate Officer Sullivan immediately as a resolution to the matter. He reached for the folder he'd left on her bedside table. This might interest you more. Officer Bennett came forward with evidence of a systematic pattern of similar stops, primarily targeting black residents in affluent neighborhoods. Margaret wasn't surprised. That young officer has a conscience. I could see it in his eyes. He does, Michael agreed. And he's willing to testify about a departmental database that essentially flags black homeowners in wealthy areas for special attention during patrols. Eleanor's knitting needles froze mid-stitch. They're keeping a list? Not officially, Michael clarified. But yes, essentially. Addresses are coded in the system with special interest designations that officers understand as targets for heightened scrutiny. As they discussed the implications, a text message alert sounded on Michael's phone. His expression darkened as he read it. Chief Wilson's disciplinary file on Sullivan is mysteriously incomplete. Key complaints from the past 2 years are missing from the official record. Margaret sighed deeply. Systems protecting systems. Your father used to say that racism wasn't just about individual hatred, it was about power structures designed to maintain the status quo. Michael squeezed her hand gently. He was right. And that's why we're not settling this quietly. Tomorrow, I'm announcing a full independent investigation into Oak Park's policing practices, backed by state authority and with subpoena power. As darkness fell outside the hospital window, the gathered protesters illuminated the street with candles and cell phone lights. A visible reminder that this incident had awakened something in the community that wouldn't easily be extinguished. Inside the warm hospital room, Margaret Ellis, educator, activist, mother, understood that her personal humiliation might become the catalyst for the very changes she and Walter had fought for throughout their lives. The systems of power that had emboldened Officer Sullivan were now confronted by different systems of power, legal authority, community solidarity, and the moral force of truth. The question remaining was which system would ultimately prevail. By Monday morning, the Oak Park Police Officers Association had mobilized its considerable resources to defend Officer Sullivan. A strongly worded statement from Union President Frank Garrity appeared in the Chicago Tribune, characterizing the incident as an unfortunate misunderstanding, while emphasizing Sullivan's 15 years of dedicated service. Behind the scenes, the union's legal team prepared for battle. Well versed in the art of delaying investigations, questioning witness credibility, and shifting public attention from systemic issues to procedural technicalities. At City Hall, Michael found a message waiting from State Senator Victor Hargrove, chairman of the Public Safety Committee and longtime recipient of police union campaign contributions. The senator's carefully worded voicemail suggested a private discussion about appropriate responses to isolated incidents, and warned against hasty actions that might undermine public confidence in our law enforcement partners. The implied threat was clear. Michael's aggressive pursuit of this case could cost him political capital he needed for other initiatives. As Michael listened to the message, Diane Chin entered his office with a disturbing update. We've identified a connection between Sullivan and powerful political figures in the state, she reported, sliding a folder across his desk. His father-in-law is Raymond Blackwell, the state police union's former president and current lobbyist. Blackwell and Senator Hargrove have been golf buddies for 20 years. Michael reviewed the documents, the web of connections explaining the resistance they were already encountering. So Sullivan has protection at the state level, he mused. That explains why his previous complaints disappeared. There's more, Diane continued. We've received reports of suspicious vehicles outside your mother's home last night. Nothing overtly threatening, but enough to concern her neighbors. And your daughter's university office received an anonymous call asking for her teaching schedule. Michael's expression hardened. The implicit threat to his family crossed a line that transformed this from a professional challenge to a personal one. Contact campus security at Northwestern and request additional monitoring of Aisha's movements. And arrange for private security at my mother's house, former law enforcement. Vetted personally by Detective Williams. As Michael's team implemented these protective measures, Margaret received visitors in her hospital room, where doctors had decided to keep her for a second night of observation. Among them was Vanessa Wright, an investigative journalist whose work on police misconduct had earned her both a Pulitzer nomination and numerous threats. Mrs. Ellis, Vanessa began after introductions. I've been tracking Officer Sullivan's patterns for nearly 2 years as part of a larger investigation into suburban policing disparities. Your case may finally provide the leverage needed to bring these patterns to light. Margaret adjusted her position in the hospital bed, the movement causing a wince of pain from her still tender wrists. What exactly have you found, Ms. Wright? 18 stops of black drivers in Oak Park's affluent neighborhoods over the past 24 months. All conducted by Sullivan. 6 resulted in searches. 4 in arrests. All 4 cases eventually dismissed, but not before the individuals spent time in jail and thousands on legal fees. The pattern is unmistakable. But without body camera footage or internal documents, I haven't been able to prove departmental knowledge or complicity. Margaret nodded thoughtfully. And now, with my son's position, you may finally get access to those records. Exactly, Vanessa confirmed. But there's resistance from unexpected quarters. Just this morning, Officer Bennett was placed on administrative leave for alleged protocol violations related to his handling of evidence from your stop. The news troubled Margaret deeply. The young officer had shown moral courage, and now he was facing consequences while Sullivan remained on paid leave. At Oak Park Police Headquarters, Chief Wilson faced mounting pressure from multiple directions. The mayor's office had submitted expansive records requests. The State Police Oversight Division had initiated a preliminary review, and community activists maintained a constant presence outside the building. In response, Wilson had adopted a 2-track strategy, publicly expressing commitment to transparency while privately directing IT staff to conduct an urgent system backup that conveniently made certain records temporarily inaccessible. The department's community affairs officer crafted carefully worded statements emphasizing the department's diversity training and community outreach efforts. Statistics that showed improvement in certain metrics while carefully avoiding mention of racial disparities in enforcement actions. Meanwhile, within the community itself, reactions to the incident revealed deep divisions along racial lines. White residents who had considered Oak Park a progressive beacon of integration expressed shock and disbelief, while many black residents responded with weary recognition of patterns they had long observed but struggled to prove. At First Baptist Church, Reverend Turner opened the doors for a community forum that quickly filled to capacity, with residents sharing personal experiences that echoed Margaret's ordeal: the unwarranted stops, the presumption of criminality, the small indignities that accumulated into collective trauma. As these community discussions unfolded, Michael's investigation team discovered that previous complaints against Sullivan had indeed been systematically buried. Records obtained through emergency court orders revealed 5 prior incidents involving black residents that had been classified as resolved without finding, despite substantial evidence supporting the complaints. In each case, the department's Internal Affairs Division had found reasons to question the credibility of witnesses or to accept Sullivan's version of events without thorough investigation. Chief Wilson's fingerprints were on each case, his signature approving the closure of investigations that any objective observer would have considered incomplete at best, corrupt at worst. As Margaret prepared to be discharged from the hospital on Tuesday morning, she received unexpected visitors, 3 families whose loved ones had experienced similar treatment by Officer Sullivan. They came bearing flowers, cards, and stories that mirrored her own experience but had ended with far more devastating consequences. Jamal Richardson, 22, had lost his scholarship after spending 2 months in jail on drug charges that were eventually dismissed. Lisa Cooper's 68-year-old husband had suffered a fatal heart attack hours after a confrontational traffic stop by Sullivan. 16-year-old Darius Washington had developed severe anxiety after being handcuffed and detained while walking home from school. Mistakenly identified as a robbery suspect despite being nowhere near the crime scene. Mrs. Ellis, Lisa Cooper said, holding Margaret's hand, "What happened to you is terrible. But if anyone can make them listen, it's you. You have a platform none of us had." Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she listened to their stories. "This was never just about me," she told them. "This is about justice for all of you too." Later that afternoon, as Margaret settled back into her home, now with a private security detail discreetly positioned on her street, Michael faced increasing political pushback. His chief of staff reported that 3 key allies on the city council had suddenly become concerned about overreach in the Oak Park investigation. Campaign donors had called expressing reservations about targeting law enforcement. Even some community leaders who had initially supported the investigation were receiving pressure to moderate their positions. At the heart of this resistance was a fundamental challenge to Michael's dual role, as a son seeking justice for his mother, and as a mayor responsible for maintaining effective working relationships with suburban police departments. As evening fell, this pressure escalated dramatically when a brick crashed through the front window of Margaret's living room, narrowly missing Eleanor Johnson, who had come to help Margaret settle in. Attached to the brick was a note containing a single word, "Enough." The implicit message was clear: back off, or the next incident might not be merely property damage. As police responded to the scene, noticeably not from Oak Park PD but from Chicago's department at Michael's insistence, Margaret picked up the brick from amid the shattered glass. Her expression resolute rather than frightened. "They think this will scare us into silence," she observed to Eleanor. "After everything we lived through in the 60s. A brick through a window is supposed to make us surrender?" Eleanor brushed glass from her cardigan. "They don't know who they're dealing with, do they?" "No," Margaret agreed, "they don't. But they're about to learn." As security teams swept the house and installed temporary covering for the broken window, Margaret made a decision that would change the trajectory of the case. She called Michael and said simply, "I want to tell my story. Not just to investigators or lawyers. To everyone. It's time people understand this isn't about one bad officer or one unlucky grandmother. It's about a system that needs to change." Michael, standing in his office overlooking Chicago's skyline, felt a surge of pride mingled with concern for his mother's safety. "Are you sure, Mom? Once you go public like that, there's no going back." Margaret's voice carried the same determination that had guided her through 6 decades of civil rights advocacy. "I'm sure. Some things are worth the risk. This is one of them." As Michael ended the call, his security detail informed him that Officer Bennett had requested an urgent meeting, claiming to have information that changes everything about the Ellis case. The resistance they faced was substantial. The retaliation already beginning, but the truth that Bennett carried and the voice Margaret was prepared to raise promised to shift the balance of power in ways the system's defenders couldn't anticipate. On Wednesday morning, Margaret Ellis returned home from the hospital to find her usually quiet street transformed. Neighbors had organized an impromptu welcome committee, lining the sidewalk with supportive signs and chalk messages of solidarity. Children from families she had taught over her long career offered handmade cards. And elderly residents who had known Margaret since she first moved to Oak Park stood in silent respect as her car passed. The broken window from the previous night's brick attack had been professionally repaired, the cost covered anonymously by a local business owner. Inside her home, Margaret found fresh flowers, prepared meals in her refrigerator, and a schedule of neighbors who had volunteered to stay with her in shifts until the threat level diminished. The community's response to intimidation had been not fear but unity. As Margaret settled in her living room, Michael arrived with news that would shape their next steps. "The department has offered a settlement," he informed her, his expression making clear his opinion of the offer. $500,000, an official apology, and Officer Sullivan's immediate termination, in exchange for a non-disclosure agreement, and your agreement not to pursue further legal action. Margaret didn't even need to consider it. Absolutely not. This isn't about money or one officer's job. This is about the entire system. That's what I told them, Michael replied with a slight smile. But there's something else you should know. He took a seat across from her, his expression growing more serious. Officer Bennett came forward with something unexpected. He's been researching departmental history and discovered that Sullivan's father, James Sullivan Sr., was one of the officers who arrested Dad during the housing protests in 1968. Margaret's breath caught. Walter's arrest? The one that put him in the hospital? Michael nodded grimly. The very same. 3 officers were involved in that beating. Sullivan Sr. was the junior officer, following orders according to the official report, but Dad always said he was the most vicious of the 3. The revelation cast the current situation in an entirely new light. What had seemed like random targeting now appeared potentially generational, a son continuing his father's pattern of racial targeting and abuse of power. Does Officer Sullivan know who I am? Who Walter was? Margaret asked, her mind racing with implications. Bennett doesn't think so. Says Sullivan isn't the type to research community history. But the coincidence is too striking to ignore. As they processed this revelation, Diane Chen arrived with Officer Bennett, who had agreed to provide formal testimony about departmental practices despite the risks to his career. Bennett, dressed in civilian clothes and visibly nervous, carried a laptop containing evidence he had meticulously gathered over months of increasing concern about his partner's conduct. Mrs. Ellis, Bennett began. I want to apologize personally for what happened to you. I should have intervened sooner. Margaret studied the young officer thoughtfully. What made you decide to come forward now? Officer Bennett? You must know this will likely end your career with Oak Park PD. Bennett nodded, his expression resolute despite his anxiety. My grandfather was one of Chicago's first black police lieutenants in the 1970s. He joined the force to change things from the inside. When I became an officer, I promised him I'd uphold that legacy. Sunday made it clear I can't keep that promise by staying silent. Over the next hour, Bennett revealed the extent of the department's problematic practices, an unofficial but widely understood protocol for targeting suspicious vehicles in affluent neighborhoods, with suspicious serving as thinly veiled code for minority drivers. More disturbing was his revelation about a digital flagging system in the department's database that marked addresses where black homeowners resided in predominantly white neighborhoods, ostensibly for community awareness, but practically functioning as targeting guidance for officers like Sullivan. And Chief Wilson? Michael asked. How much does he know about these practices? He doesn't just know, Bennett replied, opening a folder containing printed emails. He designed the flagging system 5 years ago when he was Deputy Chief of Operations. Called it proactive community monitoring. The evidence Bennett provided was damning. Departmental emails discussing the Neighborhood Integrity Program, in coded language. Statistics showing dramatically higher stop rates for minority drivers, and documentation of complaint suppression techniques that had protected officers like Sullivan for years. By midday, Michael had initiated formal proceedings for a state-level investigation with independent oversight. Governor Pratt, recognizing both the political necessity and moral imperative, announced the formation of a special task force with subpoena power and resources to conduct a comprehensive review of Oak Park's policing practices. The public announcement sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community and signaled to other departments that the protective wall of silence was beginning to crumble. As these official mechanisms engaged, Margaret made a decision that would amplify their impact exponentially. With Vanessa Wright's assistance, she agreed to a televised interview sharing her experience in detail, not as the mayor's mother seeking special treatment, but as a lifelong educator and civil rights advocate exposing patterns that affected countless others without her platform or protection. The interview, broadcast that evening on Chicago's most watched news program, was powerful in its restrained emotion and devastating in its methodical presentation of facts. Margaret described the incident without embellishment, her dignity and composure making the injustice all the more apparent. When asked about her feelings toward Officer Sullivan, her response captured the essence of her character. "I don't hate this young man. I pity him. He's a product of systems designed to perpetuate fear and division. What I want isn't punishment but transformation, of individuals, departments, and communities." The interview resonated across Chicago and beyond, with social media amplifying Margaret's story nationwide. By Thursday morning, the hashtag #JusticeForMargaret was trending nationally, and civil rights organizations had issued statements of support and offers of legal assistance. At Oak Park Police Headquarters, the pressure intensified when Chief Wilson was recorded during what he believed was a private conversation with a trusted lieutenant, discussing the need to clean up certain records before state investigators arrived. The recording, made by an administrative assistant concerned about potential evidence destruction, was anonymously delivered to both Michael's office and Vanessa Wright. Within hours of the recording becoming public, the Oak Park Village Board called an emergency session and voted to place Chief Wilson on administrative leave pending investigation, appointing Deputy Chief Rodriguez as interim leader with a mandate for transparency and cooperation with state authorities. As these developments unfolded, Sullivan remained surprisingly silent, declining interview requests and staying secluded in his suburban home. His union representatives continued to speak on his behalf, but their statements grew increasingly defensive as evidence mounted. The narrative had shifted decisively, with Sullivan now widely perceived not as an officer who made a mistake but as the embodiment of systematic abuses that had gone unchecked for too long. The community response continued to build, with a peaceful demonstration outside Oak Park Village Hall growing from a few dozen participants on Thursday to over 3,000 by Saturday. The diverse crowd included longtime civil rights activists, young families, religious leaders from various faiths, and suburban residents who had previously considered police misconduct an urban problem, unrelated to their communities. Signs bearing Margaret's image alongside quotes from her interview became symbols of the movement's moral authority. While public support grew, behind the scenes, pressure on Michael intensified. State Senator Hargrove made a personal visit to his office, ostensibly to express concern but actually to deliver a thinly veiled warning about career implications of pursuing the case too aggressively. Prominent donors suggested the investigation might affect fundraising for his eventual gubernatorial run. Even Governor Pratt, while publicly supportive, privately suggested a measured approach that would satisfy public demand for accountability without destabilizing regional law enforcement. Michael listened to these cautionary voices with political pragmatism but remained unmoved in his determination. The turning point came when, returning home late Saturday night, he discovered his wife Rebecca sitting at their kitchen table with a small box containing a bullet that had been delivered to her university office with a note reading, "Back off, or else." The threat to his family crystallized Michael's resolve. This was no longer about political calculations or even professional duty. It was about the kind of world his children would inherit. About whether power would protect power or justice would prevail. On Sunday morning, exactly 1 week after Margaret's traffic stop, Michael made his decision. He would personally lead the prosecution of this case, stepping back from his mayoral duties temporarily to focus on what he now recognized as the defining cause of his career. The decision would be controversial, unprecedented, and politically risky, but it would send an unmistakable message that some principles transcended political expediency. As he shared this decision with Margaret over Sunday breakfast in her kitchen, now guarded by both private security and community volunteers, she reached across the table to take his hand. "Your father would be so proud," she said simply. "He always said justice wasn't about comfort or convenience. It was about doing what's right, especially when it's difficult." Michael squeezed her hand gently. "I learned that from both of you." As they shared this moment of connection, neither could have anticipated how the coming days would transform not just the department, but an entire region's approach to policing and community justice. The breaking point had been reached, not just for a system built on privilege and protection, but for a society finally ready to confront the disparities that had remained in the shadows for too long. Monday morning dawned clear and bright, the June sunshine illuminating Chicago's skyline as media crews assembled outside City Hall. Rumors had circulated throughout the weekend about a major announcement from Mayor Ellis, but few anticipated the scope of what was about to unfold. At precisely 10 a.m., Michael Ellis approached the podium set up on the City Hall steps, flanked by his legal team. Officer Bennett in civilian clothes, and most powerfully, Margaret Ellis, standing straight-backed and dignified in a royal blue suit that had become her signature color since her televised interview. The assembled press fell silent as Michael began to speak, his voice carrying across the plaza without the forceful rhetoric typical of political addresses. Instead, he spoke with the measured clarity of someone whose purpose transcended political calculation. "1 week ago today, my mother, Margaret Ellis, was wrongfully detained during a traffic stop that revealed not just individual misconduct but systematic failures in how we approach public safety and community justice. Today, I'm announcing a series of actions that address not merely the symptoms, but the underlying disease affecting our law enforcement systems." The crowd's murmurs quieted as Michael continued. "Rather than pursuing traditional prosecution against Officer Sullivan alone, which would address a single case while leaving the system intact, I am announcing the establishment of a comprehensive consent decree for the Oak Park Police Department, developed in partnership with community leaders, civil rights organizations, and law enforcement reform experts." What followed was not the punitive approach many had expected but something more revolutionary, a complete reimagining of policing structures for the suburb that would serve as a model for regional reform. The consent decree included mandatory body cameras with civilian oversight of footage, comprehensive racial bias training with measurable outcomes, community review boards with actual disciplinary authority, and most significantly, the redirection of 30% of the department's budget toward community-based crisis response teams for mental health emergencies, youth intervention programs, and restorative justice initiatives. As Michael outlined these structural changes, Margaret stepped forward to address the specific case that had catalyzed these reforms. Officer Sullivan's actions last Sunday were not isolated incidents but part of a pattern affecting countless citizens without my advantages of visibility and connection, she stated, her educator's voice projecting clearly despite her recent health challenges. This morning, based on evidence collected by Officer Bennett and others, criminal charges have been filed against Officer Sullivan for evidence tampering, filing false reports, and civil rights violations. Additionally, charges have been filed against Chief Wilson for obstruction of justice related to the systematic burial of civilian complaints. The announcement sent shockwaves through the assembled crowd. Never before had a police chief in the region faced criminal charges for administrative actions that had previously been considered standard departmental procedure. The message was clear: the wall of impunity was crumbling. As Margaret stepped back, Officer Bennett approached the microphone, visibly nervous but determined. As police officers, we take an oath to protect and serve all citizens equally. When that oath is broken systematically, remaining silent makes us complicit. Today, I'm announcing my acceptance of a position on Oak Park's new Civilian Oversight Committee, where I hope to help rebuild trust between law enforcement and the communities we serve. The press conference continued with the announcement of Margaret's role as honorary chairperson of a new community healing initiative designed to address the historical traumas and ongoing impacts of discriminatory policing practices. The program would include truth and reconciliation sessions, community dialogue facilitated by trained mediators, and educational programs for both officers and residents about the history of policing and its relationship to racial dynamics in America. Following the formal announcements, implementation began immediately. By midweek, Oak Park's interim police leadership had initiated department-wide retraining, prioritizing de-escalation techniques and implicit bias recognition. Every officer's complaint history was under review by an independent panel, with patterns of concerning behavior flagged for intervention. Body cameras became mandatory for all officers, with footage automatically uploaded to servers accessible by both department supervisors and civilian oversight committee members. The transformation extended beyond procedural changes to cultural shifts within the department. Officers who had previously remained silent about problematic practices began coming forward. Encouraged by Bennett's example and the protective provisions established in the consent decree for those who reported misconduct. Meanwhile, in the broader community, Margaret's vision for healing took shape through neighborhood forums where residents shared experiences with police, both positive and negative, to build a more complete understanding of community and EDS and law enforcement realities. Church basements, community centers, and school auditoriums became spaces for difficult but necessary conversations about race, power, and justice. The ripple effects spread beyond Oak Park to surrounding communities, with suburban police departments voluntarily adopting elements of the consent decree rather than risking similar scrutiny. Political leaders who had initially pressured Michael to pursue a more moderate approach now claimed credit for supporting bold reform. The shifting political winds making courage suddenly convenient for Officer Sullivan and Chief Wilson. The consequences were appropriately severe but focused on accountability rather than vengeance. Both men faced criminal trials that would ultimately result in convictions, though with sentences designed to balance punishment with rehabilitation. More significant than their individual penalties was the systematic dismantling of the structures that had protected and enabled their behavior for years. Perhaps the most meaningful outcome came 6 months later, when Margaret established the Ellis Family Scholarship Fund for children affected by police misconduct, creating educational opportunities for those whose lives had been disrupted by the very systems her family had fought to reform. The fund's first recipients included Jamal Richardson, who would return to college to complete his degree, and Darius Washington, whose experience with Officer Sullivan had nearly derailed his academic future. On a crisp autumn morning 1 year after the traffic stop that had catalyzed these changes, Margaret Ellis drove her Lincoln Continental through the streets of Oak Park, heading to a community center where she would speak to a graduating class of newly trained police officers who had completed a curriculum she had helped design, emphasizing community connection, historical context, and ethical decision-making. As she stopped at a traffic light, a police cruiser pulled alongside her. The officer inside, a young woman who had been among the first recruited under the department's new diversity initiative, nodded respectfully to Margaret before continuing on her patrol. The simple interaction, unremarkable to casual observers, represented the transformed relationship between community and police that had seemed impossible just 12 months earlier. Margaret continued driving, her eyes briefly catching the rearview mirror where she could see the road behind her, the path already traveled, while her gaze remained primarily focused forward on the journey still to come. The work of justice was far from complete, but the path had been irrevocably altered, bending slightly closer toward the arc of justice that had guided her life's work. Have you ever witnessed or experienced a situation where someone used their privilege or position to create positive systemic change rather than just individual benefit? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If Margaret's story moved you, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with others who need to hear these powerful messages about justice, dignity, and community transformation. Thank you for joining us for this journey through one of Chicago's most important recent stories of courage and change. Remember, true justice isn't just about punishing wrongdoing, it's about reimagining and rebuilding systems that work for everyone. Margaret Ellis's story teaches us that dignity is sometimes the most powerful weapon against injustice. When faced with discrimination, her composed resistance revealed more about the broken system than any angry confrontation could have. The story reminds us that racism isn't just about individual, bad apples, but about systems designed to protect power rather than people. True justice requires examining and reforming these systems, not just punishing individuals. We learn that community solidarity can transform isolated incidents into catalysts for change. When neighbors stood witness, recorded evidence, and offered support, they created a protective circle that expanded possibilities for justice. Perhaps most importantly, this story shows that privilege carries responsibility. Michael Ellis could have sought private resolution for his mother, but instead used his position to create change for everyone. Those with power have a choice: to protect themselves or to extend protection to all. Margaret's final lesson is that justice isn't simply punitive, it's transformative. By focusing on rebuilding rather than retribution, she created something stronger than what existed before. Sometimes the most revolutionary act isn't tearing systems down, but reimagining and rebuilding them with everyone's dignity at the center. What would you have done if you witnessed Margaret's traffic stop? Would you have stood by, recorded the incident, or directly intervened? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Has someone in your community ever used their position to stand up against discrimination rather than seeking special treatment? We'd love to hear these stories of everyday heroes. If Margaret's dignity and courage resonated with you, please hit that like button to help more people discover this important story. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful narratives that expose injustice and celebrate those who fight for change. And if you know someone who needs to hear this message about standing firm in the face of discrimination, share this video with them today. Thank you for joining us in these difficult but necessary conversations. Remember, when we stand together against injustice, we create the possibility for a world where everyone is treated with the dignity they deserve.